Welcome to our podcast where today we are discussing child marriage and its sociological consequences. I will be hosting with my co-host being my mother, Lisa Stokes.
Hi, everyone.
So, child marriage is a consequence of economic stratification more so than anything else. Those who are married as children usually come from incredibly socioeconomically disadvantaged backgrounds. They usually come from rural families, and specifically in the United States, which is today's focus, they come from southern states.
It may be quite a surprise to many that this is even a concern or a problem that exists within our country.
Yes, it's a massive surprise that oftentimes, when brought up, is overlooked as something that occurs exclusively in communities of different religious faiths. But actually, child marriage occurs fairly uniformly with any highly religious community, whether they be Buddhist, Christian, Muslim, or Hindu.
Yeah, what's really surprising is that during our time, this is even an issue, and especially in our country, I know that it's something that's been highlighted in the news over the years to have been a problem in other countries. But it's interesting that it doesn't seem to be addressed in our country.
No, it doesn't. And it's surprising considering that from the years 2000 to 2015, there were almost 250,000 individuals who were married under the age of 18. 87% of those marriages do occur to women. It is a highly gendered issue, whether it is happening within the United States or in other countries. To kind of shift to how it affects the family and society in general and the women who are placed into these marriages, it's important to note how tied to poverty child marriage is and how it leads to poverty. There is perhaps a reasonable concern that looking at child marriage statistics and looking at their relation to poverty, that they are skewed based on the poverty level of the individual already. But it's important to note there are lots of factors that can influence a child becoming married, and to conflate these factors with causing poverty more so than the marriage itself and the inherently abusive nature of this marriage isn't exactly accurate.
Yeah, I can see that. It's interesting to really realize the impact that this has on individuals and families and spilling over into communities as it often does. And really why it would be something that families would feel like is a good choice for their child or even a consideration for their child, which ends up in the rather decisive measure of choosing a marriage for that child at that age.
A person might be extremely socioeconomically disadvantaged because of high school dropout rates. But if you look at the numbers, a woman who drops out of high school is 11 percentage points more likely to be poor than they otherwise would have been. However, a woman who marries young is 31 percentage points more likely to live in poverty.
It's really surprising that there's these seeming loopholes in law where somebody would be deemed old enough to be married but be unable to legally divorce or even separate from their spouse without perhaps even being considered a runaway in some states. So what options sociologically do these children have if their families chose to marry them to this individual? And if these individuals treat them poorly, what kind of options do they have? They already were in a position of not having the support they needed.
Yes, I think a thing to be noted is how much of it is fueled by the inability of teenage girls to have access to birth control or even have the ability to be safe from abusive situations. 3% of women who are married as adults are pregnant at the time of marriage. But if you look at the numbers from women who are married under the age of 18, 48% of them are pregnant when they are married. These situations can be very coercive. Feeling like there's no way to have a child or to support a child without the help of a marriage that has a 70% failure rate and is significantly more likely to leave the parent in poverty after this divorce. Women are more likely to have socioeconomic advantages if they're within a marriage relationship. However, after divorces occur, which at the age that children are allowed to marry occur at an extraordinarily high rate, these children are far more likely to end up in poverty than they would have ever been had they not been married in the first place and had they been able to live their lives.
Well, and I think it's something, there's such a disruption of the developmental process of a child to bring something like this into their lives. It's almost seen truly as, especially when there's a pregnancy involved, as a major trauma, extreme trauma to their life, which can truly affect their developmental progress throughout their life. How that affects the child being brought into that marriage is another major consideration.
This as a social cause for health issues and psychological distress is heavily researched and very, very well backed up. Women who get married before the age of 18 are significantly more likely to experience a myriad of mental health issues. There are also physical health issues, with 20-something% increase of heart attack, stroke being associated with child marriage. It destroys a chance for a future family, and there are so many factors that are consequences of economic stratification. It's interesting to consider that dropout rates are significantly higher if a teenager gets married after getting pregnant versus just being pregnant. Their dropout rates are higher, poverty rates are higher, and future unemployment is higher, and their likelihood of having another baby within a very low amount of time raises significantly if they are married versus a normal teen pregnancy.
So there's just contributing factors that are going to be, in a lot of cases, increased.
Women who enter into marriages before the age of 18 have significantly higher rates of domestic abuse versus the general population. Public policies that reduce teenage childbearing have massively positive effects on the economic well-being of many young mothers and families. So there are ways to solve it. Not to solve it. There are ways to incentivize child marriage other than changing the laws, which they should. But having access to birth control, having the ability for minors who are pregnant to participate in social programs and to have sort of a social safety net reduces the likelihood of them entering into these types of marriages.
Church communities.
Yeah, communities in general, like having social safety nets, whether they be government instituted social safety nets, or whether they be social safety nets in the form of a family structure, in the form of a neighborhood, like having those around an individual to keep them safe and to keep them out of this kind of economic desperation that leads to so many child marriages seems to be one of the best ways of combating it, other than, of course, changing the laws. It's an economic stratification issue. It's a social issue, and it affects families because so many of these women would not enter into these marriages if it wasn't for both the social aspect of it, but also because of concerns with poverty and the ability to care for a child. These have massive mental health effects and physical effects that are noticeable through generations, and it makes cycles of poverty worse by trapping young women into abusive situations that are either physically abusive or, in a way, government mandated abusive due to the lack of rights that minors have. And I think that legitimizing this form of abuse as an acceptable and legally
binding.
Yeah, and as an acceptable and legally binding way to legitimize this structure as a family structure that is worthy of the government approval, I think that it
should be abolished.
I think it should be abolished. I don't know how there can be any sanctity of marriage as an institution if these types of abuses are being allowed under its name.
I agree. Well, thank you for the discussion. I think I've learned a lot to help me understand this issue.
Yes, thank you for being a part of my discussion. It's so much easier to have somebody to talk towards, at least. And thank you for coming on.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.